Yes, as thanks a lot for the introduction, Orlando. And as you said, today I'm going to be looking at linking forest management and the carbon intensity of raw fiber. And the intent here is to try to leave off essentially where our next presenter will begin, at least conceptually, and also a little bit more literally if we think of this in terms of a supply chain. The decoupling point in the supply chain where I will stop talking about carbon accounting is, I believe, if I understand correctly, what my friend Kim Shi-Tzu is going to talk about in a minute, the beginning point of his chain of custody, so to speak, of carbon. And so just bear that in mind. That's what we're attempting to do here. Also, I agree with you, Orlando, that there is, to this day, quite a bit of argument and uncertainty and disagreement about the ways of doing carbon accounting and the answer with respect to the carbon balance of forest fiber that's the product of forest management. And I don't think are going to get all of the lights turned on today because I cannot claim to have all the answers to this, but rather what I will try to do is do a quick overview of the primary carbon accounting process, which is recognized in Canada for reporting at national and international levels, and how that works roughly, what goes in, what comes out, and approximately what the answer looks like when you run it according to this de facto standard method. And then, but there'll be, I think, opportunities during the panel and the Q&A session to maybe shed some light on where some elements of that are contested and what extra science is needed to shed some light on those things. So in summary, the forest carbon modeling is often referred to as carbon budget modeling, which is why a lot of the models that you will see that are used for forest carbon accounting and forest carbon reporting in Canada have the letters CBN in them, okay? So the most common one is called CBM-CFS3. It's developed by National Resources Canada, and it's been in development for decades and it's in widespread use. And it's basically what's used to report on a national scale to Environment and Climate Change Canada, the sort of snapshot of forest carbon balance on a periodic basis. And then Canada feeds those answers to the International Panel on Climate Change and other sort of international bodies that are interested in our national scale climate performance, including with respect to various international accords, like there was the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Accord and all of these various agreements. So this is the tool that's been used to measure our performance. Other tools exist, but just in a nutshell, if you ever hear from them, they are essentially all the same. If you boil them down to the mechanics and the data that goes inside them, it's just the outer shell and the interface that changes. So what I'll do today is I'll present the core, the motor on the inside of these machines, and I'm not going to spend any time on the interface. Nobody cares about that. And I'll just try to get you to understand how we're pushing numbers around to arrive at carbon balances for the forest. So the carbon intensity of raw fiber feedstock delivered to the mill's front gate, but not yet transformed by a primary production facility, is basically a function of four things. There's a process of capture or sequestration of atmospheric carbon in forest plants and soils through photosynthesis. There's a process of decay, which emits forest, plant, and soil carbon back into the atmosphere, which is just a natural process of dead biomass decomposing, mostly through oxidation. And there are carbon emissions from fiber procurement activities, because forest management requires us to access the forest. We have to build roads that remove some of the productive area that could otherwise be growing trees to sequester carbon, but also we drive trucks and forest machinery around, and those trucks and forest machinery have embodied emissions and also operating emissions through burning fossil fuels. So forest management strategy can affect the forest carbon flows. So for the same, say, pile of 100 tons of nice clean chips delivered to a pulp mill, you could have two identical looking piles of chips side by each, and they could have totally different net carbon balances depending on how they got there. And the interpretation of forest carbon flows does depend largely on the choice of a carbon accounting framework. What I'm trying to say is you can choose to count the carbon in a slightly different way and possibly arrive at a substantially different answer, particularly if you are ever so slightly on the emissions side of things and you change your assumptions a little bit, you could end up ever so slightly on the sequestration side of things, essentially reversing the polarity, the conclusion of the carbon balance. And that can be tricky. And circling back to one of Orlando's comments in the intro, it's these sort of reverses of polarity when you're near the boundary of carbon emission versus sequestration that I think are at the core of many of the arguments that people have been having. And it's difficult to make a constructive and useful contribution to those arguments without first doing a deep dive in exactly how all of this was calculated in the first place and understanding how that works. Otherwise, you're just picking a side and making noise. Finally, here in the summary, the different frameworks can be used, depending on the carbon reporting context. And generally speaking, if you're not trying to distort the answer, it's usually rather obvious which carbon accounting framework is the standard one in your context. And you should just use that one if you're just trying to come up with a nice balanced number. But it's also important to be clear and well-informed and honest about caveats and shortcomings and leakages so that people understand the quality of your number and the uncertainty associated with it. So carbon modeling overview of the system of how this all works. At the center of this diagram here, you have the forest that photosynthesizes, sequesters carbon in plant stems, and also emits carbon to the atmosphere through decay from dead biomass. Sometimes the forest burns through wildfire, but also sometimes we burn piles of wood, which are slash piles or harvest residue piles on the side of the road after harvesting, mostly for safety and fire prevention purposes. Sometimes these disturbed forests after a fire, they will decay some of their biomass back to the atmosphere if they are not salvaged and otherwise used for industrial processing. And eventually these disturbed or diseased forests, they regenerate and they grow back either through natural regeneration or through, deliberate anthropogenic management like planting. And once these forests regenerate, this essentially forms a loop, right? So this circle on the far left is really just right back to where we were in the first place here. And so forests here, there's a process by which, some of the biomass that dies and falls to the ground makes its way into the soils, and sometimes it stays there for a very long time. And depending on where you are and what the exact soil type is, sometimes these actually turn into fossil fuels. But that takes thousands or tens of thousands of years. So on the scale on which we are trying to mitigate climate change, essentially this fossil fuel creation process is static. It's moving so slow, it doesn't matter. And what I want to point out is, where I stop my talk today and hand it over to Professor Tsu is timber harvesting and the associated replanting activities. But then right here, everything that's sort of to the right of that, the bioenergy manufacturing, the storage of products, the disposal, the energy, and the emissions, those are all the downstream supply chain effects that I'm going to draw the line there. So when I tell you about sort of the carbon intensity, it's the carbon intensity sort of to the left of this timber harvesting bubble. So from the perspective of actually modeling carbon budget models to calculate what the carbon balance is of wood that's been the product of growing a seedling, managing a seedling, waiting until it's mature, harvesting it, putting it on a truck, bringing it to the mill. Okay, so the full balance of that chain of custody right up to the mill gate is calculated by mostly in Canada, CBM CFS3, which I mentioned earlier, developed by Natural Resources Canada. It's kind of the standard model. And so this is a diagram of sort of the general flows of information in that. So you have spatial units, which are just large areas of the forest that are managed as units, and those generally map to organizational boundaries like timber supply areas or management units. And they're subdivided into ecozones, province boundaries, and other parameters to make sure it sort of makes sense to people when they see the unit. They can relate to it. Inside those spatial units, you have inventory data for the starting point of your simulations. You have yield tables that express the growth and yield, the change over time in biomass from sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. And those growth and yield tables typically include a net effect of just natural mortality and decay from the natural stand dynamics of growth. And disturbance events like fire and pests are explicitly modeled in here to capture the effect of those. The effect of temperature and other data are also input into this model. So once you have all of this information inside the model, inside the box, there are sort of a bunch of standard data tables that have been built over decades by the Canadian Forest Service that express all of the biomass turnover, decay rates, and other kind of connections of what happens to the carbon after it's been sequestered from the atmosphere, but before it gets harvested. So this whole thing is a black box, and it knows what to do with the carbon once you feed it the correct inputs. And essentially that includes processes for modeling net growth through sequestration from the atmosphere. You then end up with a biomass pool of sequestered carbon that gets turned over through litter fall and other mortality, or with natural disturbances that immediately emit carbon back into the atmosphere. You have anthropogenic disturbances, which is just a complicated way of saying harvesting, and road construction. And what you end up with when you have either this harvesting, this natural mortality, or these disturbances is you have some dead organic material that was not immediately emitted up into the atmosphere. And then those end up in dead organic matter pools, which decay at various rates depending on what type. And the decay rates are built into the system, and they're based on field data and empirical models that have been calibrated to the best of Natural Resource Canada scientists' ability. So inside of CBM CFS3, and this is the stupidest, scariest slide I'm going to show today. So if you can get past this one, you're over the hump. I just want to show that basically above that fat black line is the above ground carbon. Below the fat black line is below ground carbon. So the black line is the ground. And the carbon inside carbon models is just literally described in terms of above ground, below ground. And there are distinct pools that are tracked in the model for above and below ground. And then for each of above and below, they're split left to right into alive and dead. And then inside of each of those subcategories, there's big, medium, small. And then all of those crazy arrows are just showing the possible pathways where you can go from alive to dead, and from above ground to below ground and to the atmosphere and back. But I'm not going to get into any details about the arrows, but just let's trust the Natural Resource Canada scientists that they made all the correct connections. So initial carbon pool stocks are in this model are for the live carbon. It's relatively easy. It's just directly imported from forest resource inventory data, which is typically collected and compiled by provincial governments. And the dead carbon pool stocks need to be estimated from this bootstrap initialization process, where they basically run the model for thousands of years with some hypotheses about the rates of natural disturbances and stuff, but no harvesting. And that just primes all the dead organic matter pools. When that system reaches a sort of a steady state, then they stop the wind up process, and then you can start simulating from the present forward assuming you want to project hypothetical forest carbon trajectories go into the future. So the changes in carbon pool stocks over time are a function of above ground biomass growth, trees growing, above ground live biomass mortality, trees dying, and above ground dead biomass decay. The trees just decompose if they're just like standing and dead or fallen and dead. Flows from above ground dead biomass pools to below ground dead biomass pools. It's just another way of saying soil formation and dynamics. Below ground dead biomass decay. So, you know, there's a certain amount of decomposition underground, and the chemical processes of that are more around anaerobic decomposition rather than aerobic decomposition when you're just out in the atmosphere. And live and dead biomass harvesting, which occurs deliberately by people who want to collect the wood and bring them to industrial processing facilities. So the growth is generally modeled using yield curves, which are derived by provincial government foresters, and it's going to be the same ones that we use for wood supply planning and annual allowable cut determination, stuff like that. Decay is generally modeled using half-life assumptions, and those are calibrated against field data to try and be as accurate as possible. Tree biomass utilization assumptions affect the flows of harvested biomass pools. What we're saying is when you harvest the trees, you never collect 100% of the merchantable timber that's in that tree. Sometimes there's a broken top, or there's an imperfection, or you cut the stump too high. So generally speaking, it's about 85% utilization in British Columbia, just to give you an example. So there's 15% of potentially merchantable, valuable wood that could have gone to a sawmill or pulp mill, but that stays in the forest, and it's spread out all over the cut block, and some of it ends up in slash piles. The stuff that's in cut blocks is basically just going to rot and decay and go back into the atmosphere, but stuff in the slash piles we can either burn or try to reuse, for example, for bioenergy. Wood density affects the conversion of biomass volume to mass of carbon. So, tree species that just are more dense will have more carbon in them, all other things being equal. So just quickly linking forest management activities to carbon intensity. All the stuff I talked about before is just calculating using the most objective science we have available what the answer is, but we can affect that answer by choosing to manage the forest in different ways. So looking at the fact that we're modeling tree growth with yield curves, and that the shape of the yield curves affects the growth increment and the yield at harvest, and that the shape of the yield curve varies with species composition, site, and silviculture regime. Foresters can predict that these yield curves will basically max out in their average growth rate at a certain mean annual increment, and that's forester talk. So for you non-foresters, just roll with me on this one. But basically, it helps us determine an optimal rotation age at which we can harvest the stands and get the maximum productivity out of that stand. If we harvested it younger, we'd lose increment. If we harvested it later, we'd lose increment. Just believe me on this one. So the point is, it's very tempting for foresters, all other things being equal, to always harvest stands at the optimal rotation age, unless there's something else, like maybe carbon management, that would push us to deviate from that. So it's just important to understand that there's a sort of an age that's the one to which forest managers will always gravitate unless there's something pulling them away from it. And stand level management can affect this mean annual increment in this rotation age. For example, we can accelerate growth with fertilization or thinning treatments or other stand improvement treatments, which can cost money and might have carbon emissions associated with them, but they can change the growth trajectory. So those will also change the rotation age and the yield, which ultimately will affect the way we model carbon balance, because the harvesting disturbances, the yields, and the growth curves are all part of the carbon model. Harvesting intensity and pattern, like selection cutting versus clear cutting, or highly aggregated harvesting on the landscape versus highly dispersed harvesting on the landscape, can have an effect on the carbon balance. For example, selection cutting means you have to cut a stand in at least 2 or more passes, which means by definition, mathematically, you cannot always be harvesting at the optimal rotation age because that requires clear cutting at exactly 1 pass. So any deviation from that, you're going to lose some increment in an even aged stand. And when you have a highly dispersed harvest pattern, you definitely have to build more roads. So there's going to be more transportation, more road impacts, and that's going to have an impact on carbon. Forest, fire, and pest management policy is going to change how much of the forest you allow to burn. And we have a lot of control over that, but we can't always afford to do anything about it. And the final thing I want to say is that the utilization rates and harvest residues are, to a certain extent, under our control. So we can choose to collect more of the harvest byproduct and stack it up on the side of the road and send it to a bioenergy facility, or we can choose to just spread it out all over the place, or we can choose to burn it. And those choices have an impact on the carbon intensity of delivered fiber. So there you go. That's where I'm going to stop.